So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, the legacy of voter suppression. I'm Katie Kelly. I'm the Special Programs Coordinator here at the Orange County Regional History Center. Our organization is located in downtown Orlando, and we offer 3 floors of permanent exhibitions, renowned special exhibitions from the Smithsonian, and a variety of interactive, unique experiences and programs for guests of all ages. While the History Center is partially funded by Orange County, donations to the Historical Society of Central Florida are vitally important to the center's ability to serve the community and continue to fulfill our mission to serve as the gateway for community engagement, education, and inspiration by preserving and sharing Central Florida's continually unfolding story. Donations allow for the care and upkeep of the historic collection, presentation of special exhibitions, and offering innovative programs like the one we're offering today. I have put a link, or I'm going to put a link in the chat, I should say, for anyone who's interested in supporting the museum and the Historical Society. And it's not just monetary support. There are a couple of different ways you can support us. So please, if you're interested in supporting what we're doing here, I urge you to visit that website that I'll put in the chat. Today's program is being facilitated as a webinar. So that means that attendees do not have access to your video and audio. We will save some time at the end for questions, so please feel free to put any questions you may have for our panel in the chat as they come up, as they occur to you. Shannon will be monitoring that chat for us, so she will be able to pull out your questions to pose to the panel. And just so you're aware, I have the chat set up so that you are talking directly to the panelists and hosts for this webinar. So we have a great panel lined up for you today to address today's topic. And so without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Shannon Elliston, who is our school services manager here at the museum. She'll introduce our panelists and she will be guiding today's discussion.
Thanks, Katie. So as Katie said, my name is Shannon and I'm school services manager here, and I will be hosting today's discussion about the legacy of voter suppression. But we are so lucky to be joined by a couple panelists today and representatives of several different organizations in our community that are on the ground doing this work every day. So they're going out, they're registering, they're mobilizing voters, and they're working to help fight back against voter suppression, which is really what the focus of this conversation is going to be about today. So before we get started, I do want to introduce all of our panelists. So joining us from the League of Women Voters, we have Kathy Sheeran, who is the chair of the Voter Services Committee. We have Denise Burton, who is the subcommittee chair of the Speaker Bureau. And from the Council on American Islamic Relations, Florida, we have Lara Ghannam, who is the Central Florida Regional Coordinator of CAIR Florida. And from Allianza for Progress, we have Marcos Vilar, who their executive director. So today, this incredible panel we have is going to help us understand the roots of voter suppression tactics and policies, how that has evolved to what we're seeing today, and the impact that voter suppression has on our communities. They're also going to share some ways that you can get involved to help combat voter suppression in our community. So like Katie mentioned, if you have any questions throughout today's discussion, you can type them in the chat at any time. I will be monitoring that and we will circle back to those questions at the end, but feel free to type them in as they come to you so we have them there at the end if there's anything you would like us to address. But without further delay, we're going to go ahead and get this conversation started. So I think for many of us, when we hear voter suppression, we think of it as a problem of the past. We think about like Jim Crow era policies. So I think that is a good place to start this conversation. So Denise, can you give us a brief overview of historic voter suppression and the roots of the types of things that we're seeing today?
Yes, thank you, Shannon and Katie and the History Center for inviting us to participate in this panel today. I just would like to start with giving a definition of what we feel is voter suppression. It's any strategy whose purpose or practical effect is to reduce voting, registering to vote by members of a targeted racial group, political party, or religious community. So with that, I'd like to say, is voting suppression something new? No, unfortunately, it is not. It's been going on since the inception of our country. In the beginning of our country, in 1789, when the Constitution was ratified, per Section 4, it gave the states, not the federal government, the authority for the methods, manners, and policies of how to vote in the federal election to the states. So the states are in control of that. And that happened in 1789, as I said. And at that time, at the first election, only 10% of the population was eligible to vote for George Washington in that election. So that's a very small number. In general, the states had some requirements that each individual had to be in order to be eligible to vote. And there were 5 main requirements that all states kind of sign on to. And they were, you had to be male, you had to be white, you had to be a landowner, you had to be Protestant, and you had to be 21. Those are the 5 requirements. So as you can see, that kind of bounced out a lot of people, the 90% that weren't represented. So as we move on, as time went on and after the Civil War and during Reconstruction, the federal government put into place some amendments to the Constitution and other acts to try to include more people and to try to reduce the disenfranchised Americans that could not vote because of the requirements. So we went from 1789 to the very first amendment, 1865, pretty long period of time. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States. Then in 1868, the 14th Amendment granted all persons born or naturalized in the US citizenship. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was granted, and the 15th Amendment allowed people to vote if they did not own land, were not Protestant, and were non-whites. But they still required women and people under the age of 21 not eligible to vote. Now, just because this was a federal law, which we think, okay, that took care of it, it really didn't take care of it, because some of the states put into place polling taxes, violence at the polls. And so people, even though they were under federal law able to vote legally, they weren't able to physically vote because of these requirements, these unburdened requirements. And it was overwhelmingly a majority of African Americans that were affected by this, as well as poor people in the South. So as we move on from 1870 to 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, and that gave the women the right to vote. In that election in 1920, 8 million women voted. So prior to that election, 8 million women were suppressed from voting. So that's how much we increased it with that law. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act granted citizens of Native Americans. Native Americans were also prohibited from voting because they weren't considered US citizens. However, even though that act was passed in 1924, some states said, well, they weren't state residents, so they weren't allowed to vote because they lived on reservations. So in New Mexico, Native Americans were actually prohibited from voting until 1962. So again, a federal law is passed giving them the right and privilege to be American citizens and to vote, and yet states' rules and regulations suppressed that vote up until 1962 in this particular case. Moving on, 1964 was the Civil Rights Act, and that outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, religious, sex, or national origin, required equal access to public places and employment, and enforced desegregation of schools and the right to vote. Then in 1965, we had the Voting Rights Act, which prohibited the literacy test and racial discriminations that we had just talked about previously that prevented people from actually voting because they were either scared or they couldn't meet these unrealistic requirements. And this was a landmark case for the civil rights movement. So that was 1965. In 1971, during the Vietnam War, 18-year-olds were drafted to go fight in that war. They were drafted by Congress, but they weren't allowed to vote. So they were suppressed from their voting, disenfranchised from their voting because they weren't eligible to vote because you had to be 21. So the 26th Amendment granted 18-year-olds the right to vote. And the slogan during that time was, if you're old enough to fight for your country, you're old enough to vote for the people who are going to put you there. So as you can see, there have been many laws that have come into play to try to increase the voter base, to try to work with suppression. But does that mean that it's actually gone away? No, it hasn't. Jim Crow laws referred to many laws that were passed in the South that enforced a rigid system of racial segregation and curtailed the power of voting. And in 2013, the Supreme Court weakened the Voting Rights Act by striking down Section 4B, which required the states to grant federal oversight to voting practices. What had happened was 9 mostly Southern states, and let's see if we can guess who they were. They were Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia. Sound familiar with what's going on today in today's news? Also included were some counties in California, Florida, New York, North Carolina, South Dakota, and Michigan. They brought this case to the Supreme Court because the US Constitution, as I mentioned before, says that states have to dictate their policies on voting, and they felt that this federal oversight by the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional. Unfortunately, it did pass 5-4, and it struck down these requirements because the court ruled that the 15th Amendment adequately covered concerns, so it wasn't needed. We also have the issue of gerrymandering. That's still going on today when we're trying, even now with the new census that has come out, we are trying to draw those party lines and trying to draw lines so that they're equal, but sometimes they get drawn in a specific party. So that is also going on today. And we are trying to combat that. The League of Women Voters has been very active in that as well. But let's move up to today. And also the 24th Amendment in 1964, I'm not sure if I mentioned that or not, but that eliminated poll taxes. So again, we're moving forward in that aspect, trying to address the suppression that was going on. But what's going on exactly today? Well, HR 1 and S1 for the People Act deals with the nuts and the bolts of election administration issues. And the act passed the House in March of 2021, and it waits a Senate vote. It increases voter access. It promotes election integrity and security, bipartisan commission on redistricting. It watches campaign finances and provides guidance on ethics for the 3 branches of government. So that's a very important move forward in trying to get a federal law to address these specific issues. We also have HR 4, which is the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act. And one of its main purposes is try to reverse what happened in 2013 and reinstate all of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And it directly targets the issue of racism and discrimination in our electoral process. And it responds to the Supreme Court Shelby decision, eliminating preclearance. The act was passed by the House in December of 2019, and it does await a Senate vote. But it creates a pathway for the federal government to challenge new voting laws, requires public notice for any changes made to voting laws, and requires the process of preclearance so that the Justice Department can take a look at these practices and make sure that they meet the requirements of the Voting Rights Act. And on a state level, in 2018, Amendment 4 was passed. Prior to that, nonviolent felons had to go through a clemency council to get their votes restored. So in 2018, Amendment 4 restored voting rights to the nonviolent felons once their sentence requirements were met. So that kind of brings us up to today. I am going to turn it over to Kathy, and she's going to talk about SB 90. So that's kind of the history, and we're bringing it right up to today.
Great. So Kathy, you can just jump on in.
Okay, great. Thank you again for having us today, Shannon and Katie, and thanks to the Orange County History Center for organizing this great event. Even though the supervisors of elections of both parties said that the 2020 election was safe and secure, the new voting bill, also called SB 90, was still enacted in May. This legislation is being challenged in court by several organizations, including the League of Women Voters. So it could be subject to change. But as of right now, I'm going to tell you about some of the key details of the bill. A vote by mail ballot request is only good for elections through the end of the calendar year for the next regularly scheduled federal election. So what that means is if you request a vote by mail ballot today, it is good through the end of 2022. The Supervisor of Elections Office sends out a notice of election prior to each election, and it will have the status of your vote by mail ballot request. So you don't have to remember whether you asked for one or not. And you can always go to the Supervisor of Elections website and check there. When requesting a vote by mail ballot, a voter must provide their Florida driver's license number, a Florida ID card number, or the last 4 digits of your Social Security number. And if you need any help getting these IDs, Vote Riders and iDignity are 2 organizations that can help you. Their websites will be listed at the end of this presentation for you to get the information. Another key factor is that drop boxes are now less accessible. Dropbox availability is limited to early voting sites only during their hours of operation, and it's also at the Supervisor of Elections office. Drop boxes must be monitored now at all times by election personnel. You can always check the location of drop boxes at the Supervisor of Elections website. I will also have his website listed at the end of this presentation. There are also very strict limits on helping other voters. A voter may only collect and deliver their own ballot, ballots for their immediate family members, and ballots for a maximum of 2 other voters per election. That's all you can do to help. Also, voters may no longer get to choose their own municipal or county representatives if the representative resigns to run for another office. Previously, such positions would be filled through a special election. Now, these vacancies may now be appointed by the governor. Also, voters with prior felony convictions who have had their rights restored no longer benefit from a public record exemption that protected them from being targeted and having their votes challenged. And partisan challenges to mail ballots are now easier. Partisan observers can protest a voter's signature on the mail ballot envelope and are now allowed closer observation of the nonpartisan canvassing boards. If you want to update your existing voter registration and change, say, your name, address, or party affiliation, you will now require to give additional information. You will need your Florida driver's license number, your Florida ID card number, or the last 4 digits of your Social Security number. It also prohibits any non-poll worker from giving food or drink, or even water, to voters waiting in line. They must stand 150 feet away from the polling location or the drop box. Only Supervisor of Elections staff can give anything to those in line. And third-party voter registration organizations, such as the League of Women Voters, must provide signage when conducting a voter registration event that informs the applicant that we may not deliver the voter registration form to the Supervisor of Elections office by the deadline, and that the applicant can deliver by mail, or take it to the Supervisor of Elections office themselves, or they can register online. The League has never had a problem with delivering voter registration forms to the SOE office in a timely manner, but yet we must now say this to comply with the law. And The bill does not allocate any state funding to support the significant administrative changes required. The full cost now falls on county budgets. So you, the taxpayer, are now funding these additional requirements. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kathy. So I think that's really important in our community to understand the implications of SB 90. That's the one thing that's really impacting us here in Central Florida right now. But it's definitely not a problem that's just impacting Central Florida. I think because we saw such historic levels of voter turnout in this previous election, that we're also seeing unprecedented levels of efforts to disenfranchise voters in the aftermath of that election as well. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, recently 18 states have enacted 30 laws with voting restrictions, and there's hundreds more bills that have been proposed in 47 states. So even though this is happening here in our community, this is something that's happening all over the country as well. I know Denise mentioned this earlier. I know we're all probably going to talk about it again at some point during this conversation, but I think one of the things to really keep in mind with this is the For the People Act. This is kind of where everything is leading to right now. There's this week even, there's a whole movement around this in Washington, D.C. There's many state legislators there, including our representative here in Orlando, Anna Escamani, is there, along with many other lawmakers from other states, trying to get this bill passed, because it really is one of the best ways and one of the most comprehensive ways to address what's happening all across the country, but definitely here with SB 90 as well. So if you find yourself wanting to get involved or wanting to research this more, I would highly recommend starting with that act. So now that we have a better understanding of how we got to this point where we are now, I think it's also important to understand the impacts that voter suppression tactics and legislation have on specific communities of voters. So for this conversation, I would love to hear from both Lara and Marcos on how you see this impacting constituents in your communities. So Lara, can you start us off?
Sure. Thank you so much, Shannon. And thank you, Denise and Kathy, for the rundown on voter suppression. I just want to say that it is extremely important that we must recognize that voter suppression is rooted in racism and white supremacy, because we see these racist tactics of voter suppression against majority Black and Brown communities. Those are the communities who are affected the most by these tactics. So in addition to what was laid out by Kathy and Denise, and as Denise had mentioned, Amendment 4, formerly incarcerated individuals are majority Black or Brown. And so even when Amendment 4 was passed, reinstating their right to vote, more legislation was proposed that put up barriers, such as requiring these returning citizens, these formerly incarcerated returning citizens, to pay a poll tax, paying all the fines and fees from their sentence before they could vote. However, documenting all of these fines and fees, it was extremely difficult to track and enforce. So we have to recognize that laws, especially here in the South, are rooted in Jim Crow era initiatives, specifically designed to deny Blacks the right to vote. So I wanted to just, put that out there, because in addition to the racist legislative tactics that we see, I also want to address another form of voter suppression that many people don't consider. We already have a hard enough time to get people out to vote before any of this legislation. But when it comes to the Muslim community, many Muslims come from immigrant backgrounds. They come from countries with authoritarian regimes that don't practice forms of democracy and don't respect freedom of speech and opinions. So there's that fear of government. But also we see issues here such as language barriers, where many of the Muslim community speak something other than English or Spanish here in Florida, or the lack of knowledge and education about the voting process. But in general, with the Muslim community in the United States, immigrant background or not, there's a lack of trust in the government due to discrimination and the political rhetoric against Muslims, such as the Muslim ban. We have the Patriot Act. We have FBI entrapment schemes and so many others. And while this isn't strictly prevalent to the Muslim community, it's to all minority communities. For example, we see this issue with police brutality against the Black community and the lack of accountability thereof. We also see immigrant stereotyping of the Hispanic community. So while there's the legislative and these legal maneuvers of voter suppression, there's also the mindsets that communities have due to government discrimination, which in turn leads to the lack in trust in government, which discourages people from wanting to engage in the system because, as we hear so often, my vote doesn't matter anyway, nothing will change. And therefore, that is a form of voter suppression people don't often consider. And this is a very big issue we see in the Muslim community. That's something that we really face on top of the other known forms of voter suppression that Kathy and Denise had discussed.
Awesome, thank you. I really appreciate that. And Marco, is there anything you would like to add?
Well, first of all, Shannon, thank you, and thank Katie and the Orange County History Center for having us together today. I want to say that to me, it's a huge privilege to be in this panel with such distinguished co-panelists. Denise laid out an incredible, detailed, and quick version of the history of voter suppression in this country, and Kathy talked about HB 90 and the threats that HB 90 poses towards democracy in Florida. And of course, Lara did a magnificent job talking about how even beyond the laws, the suspicion and the prejudice that exists towards certain people also is a form of suppression when it's implemented, as Denise well noted, in many ways in the implementation of who can vote and who cannot vote, despite the laws that are in the books. So I am just at awe and so proud and honored to be part of this panel. I wanted to say, first of all, that I believe democracy is a very fragile thing. It's something that this country was founded on, and as Denise mentioned, was imperfect from the very beginning. Imperfect because it was, I think, developed under a sense of privilege, not a sense of right. And I think that this struggle between whether voting is a privilege or whether voting is a right is something that we have struggled as a country from the very inception of the country. And at one point, that privilege was held to, like Denise said, only 10% of the population. Women were not allowed to vote. Black people were not allowed to vote. Imagine that. The authentic inhabitants of this land, the Native Americans, were not allowed to vote. And so voting from the very beginning in this country has been an act of privilege. And the Constitution has been changed and laws have been developed in order to grow democracy and ensure that all citizens and all the people of the United States have an equal right to vote. But we clearly are not there yet. I don't want to repeat anything of the things that other panelists said, but I do want to give a specific example of how the Latino community faces discrimination at the time of voting. I'm Puerto Rican. I was born in Puerto Rico. I'm a citizen of the United States because Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States. So I moved to the United States with the right to vote in any of the 50 states, and I can vote for president. Yet my name is Marcos Vilar, and it's a very Spanish name, something that anyone reading in a voter roll might think, well, this guy might be an immigrant. This guy might not be a citizen. And the fact is that the great majority of Hispanics in this country are US citizens by law, either by birth or by process of citizenship, acquiring their citizenship. Particularly in Florida, and this goes back to the days of Rick Scott being governor of Florida, he did a yearly routine where he would go up and have a press conference and say that there were many thousands and hundreds of thousands of Latinos who were registered improperly. There were illegal residents and non-citizens that were illegally registered to vote. He would make that claim. Many people challenged it. He never proved that it was true. Yet it was the basis of scrapping hundreds of thousands of people every 2 years from the voter rolls. It was also propaganda that led to people suspecting any person with a Hispanic name that came to vote, whether that person was legitimate citizen or not. So the question of whether this person had the right to vote, even if he was on the rolls, was to be interpreted by every individual poll worker or poll worker that is processing your elections. So automatically, like Lara said, it's a veil of suspicion on anybody who has a Hispanic name. So I think that these are tactics that have been used. We're in a very dangerous moment. It's sad for me to see that the country went from having its first African-American president in the person of Barack Obama just a few years ago. And that now, just 4 or 5 years later since his presidency, we are fighting these backward laws that are trying to instill voter suppression and instill more difficulties and more hurdles for ordinary citizens to be able to vote. It's undemocratic. It's not what this country is all about. And I think that we need to fight and do everything possible to make sure that this fragile democracy, which we all enjoy, remains a democracy. And particularly when we have a governor who does not believe in democracy, believes only in privilege of a few, could conceivably appoint in our own neighborhoods where we have common sense and reason and democracy, impose a person on us to rule us locally just because that seat opened, as Kathy explained, is now law under HB 90. So we're living in very dangerous times, dangerous times when it comes to considering whether we might lose our democratic rights. And as individuals, as people, as communities, we need to come together and fight hard to protect those democratic rights that we have gained and to continue making voting easier, not making it harder.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate both of you sharing your experiences and bringing some insight into these things that we don't always think about when we think about voter suppression, like how you were saying, it's not just the legislation, it's the mental barriers as well, that there's things that are not tangible that are stopping people from going to the polls as well. And particularly, Marcos, with you talking about the purge voter rolls, I think that's something we're hearing about a lot more now. And it's something that I know I never thought of before, that I would need to constantly check and make sure that I am still registered to vote. I think there's this idea that once you are registered forever. And we're seeing that that is not always the case. So I appreciate you bringing that up as well, because I think that is a huge part of the discussion happening right now too. So to expand a little bit on what both of you just said, I would be interested to hear what types of challenges you face when you're working to mobilize voters in your community, and what do you think can be done about that? So just kind of expanding on what you had already said, but what are some of the things you think people can do to help this feel a little more accessible to everybody? And Marcos, I'll have you start this one off.
Thank you, Shannon. Well, I think Lara will agree with me that anyone coming for the first time, even for a citizen from Puerto Rico who comes with the benefit of citizenship, the political system in Puerto Rico is very different. Voting in Puerto Rico is very different, and it's different state to state. Florida is a state where a lot of people are coming in from the 50 other states. It's one of the states that grew representation because of the growth of its population. But it's also one of the states that has the largest number of people from outside of the United States, particularly from Latin America, although not exclusively, obviously. And when people are coming to a new place, to a new country, you wouldn't think so, but there's really different laws, different customs, and different procedures in terms of how you go through the whole process of getting registered to vote, getting information about who to vote for, understanding the two-party system. In many countries, there's systems that have multiple parties, and they build coalitions in order to figure out who's going to be the leader. In Puerto Rico, we have a multiple party system that is structured not so much on a left-wing, right-wing spectrum, but it's more around what happens to Puerto Rico. Should Puerto Rico remain a territory? Should it become a state, or should it become independent? And that's a frame that has nothing to do with conservative or liberal. It's a frame that has to do with the resolution of the fact that Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. So everybody coming to the United States come from a different political context, and they have to come in and learn the new political context. So that in itself is a huge hurdle. And it takes a while for people to adapt and understand and feel confident in making such an important decision, which is not a decision. Voting is not a decision about yourself and what you're doing for yourself. It's a decision of what you're doing for everyone that's around you, right? Because your result and your vote is going to end up making an impact on what everybody else has to do. So it's a big decision, a very weighty decision. The first time I went to vote, my heart was pounding because I said, oh my God, I'm going to make, my vote is going to make a difference in one way or the other. And it's going to determine who is the leader of all of the people that surround me. So I think that it's a very powerful thing. And some people are intimidated by that. And if they don't understand the politics, they don't understand the system, they just stay out. And I think that's one of the big challenges for us in the Latino communities, to get people out to vote and to get people to feel confident that they know how to vote, but beyond that, that they know who to vote for. And that is a big challenge, particularly, like I said, when you're coming from a completely different political construct. So I think that's one of the big challenges. And now these laws that are coming up now is just another thing to worry about, another hurdle. Are you telling I have to tell somebody if I register them to vote, hey, I might not be able to turn. I might be an irresponsible person, by the way. Don't trust me. No, don't get, you're basically telling the person, don't register to vote with me. If you have to tell them by law that, I might not turn in your ballot. That is so ridiculous. And it's so undemocratic, because you're basically forcing somebody to say something. I don't think that's freedom of speech. I think that that's a violation of the Constitution of the United States, by the way. But it's like that. In their construct of trying to make voting a privilege, they are adding every single little possible detail as a hurdle to voting for people who vote, people who have the right to vote in this country.
Awesome. Thank you, Marcos. And Lara, do you find similar challenges? Do you think that your challenges feel a little bit different?
Well, in addition to the issues that I mentioned before with mobilizing the community to get out and vote, we also have a hard time reaching people because the community-centered places like mosques, where we could really engage the Muslim community, might not want to get engaged in any form of politics for the reasons that I mentioned, in addition to others, even something like voting, because they don't understand that it's nonpartisan and won't affect their status as a religious institution. I've actually been asked this question so many times by mosque leaders: is it okay to have a voter registration drive and remain nonpartisan? Absolutely. And again, as Marcos had mentioned, people are coming from a different political context in our community. So because there's that lack of education and understanding of the voting process here, some people, some institutions, whatever it is, they just don't want to get involved. So it's imperative on our part, as the educated on these matters, to educate our communities, which is something we are working on here at CAIR Florida. And then we had COVID during a vital election year, which made it even more difficult to get out to any place to engage the community because of the pandemic. But something else that we saw with the last presidential election season was that there are so many organizations doing this get out the vote work. So there's a lot of overlap of who we're calling, texting, reaching out to register and to remind people to vote. So when there's multiple organizations contacting the same people, honestly, it can get a bit annoying. And so it discourages people from answering their phones because they don't want yet another phone call about voting. So this lack of coordination between all of our different organizations is also a challenge we're seeing. But with this last election, actually, we did see more of a turnout than years prior because there were policies that were directly affecting the Muslim and immigrant community. So they were more interested in getting involved than years prior. We saw the policies such as like the Muslim ban and denial of visas and asylum and refugee status and whatnot. So there's a lot of lessons we've learned over the years, but we'll continue to do this work despite the challenges.
Awesome. So kind of wrapping up this portion of the conversation, I think it can feel a little overwhelming when there's so much information, and it is kind of all pretty negative in the way that it's practiced, right? When we're talking about voter suppression, there isn't really like a silver lining there. So I think a good way for us to start wrapping this conversation up is to think about what that silver lining is, right? So I would love to ask all of you, what is one thing you hope the audience takes away today from either the work that you're doing or the conversation we have had? What is one thing you hope people take away from this conversation today? And Lara, I'm going to have you start us off.
Sure. Well, I'll just give a background on what we did here at CAIR Florida. We tried to combat the challenges that we usually see by really engaging the Muslim community, which is such an underserved population. So last year, we had a great Get Out the Vote campaign. Our campaign was in 3 parts. We had direct contact and targeting of Florida Muslim voters. We also had voter education and resources, because again, that's so important that we share with these communities. And we also had media and digital campaigns. So in November, we had over 60 events, programs, and different initiatives, with the focal point being our GOTV campaign, or Get Out the Vote campaign. So we actually contacted over 100,000 Muslim voters via phone. We sent over 100,000 text messages, and we also got 41 canvassers. So that's a big deal in our community for people to even get involved in that aspect, to encourage others to vote. We had 4 party at the polls across the states, with over 2,000 voters were given CAIR materials and prizes. We created over 35 election and census educational resources, because it was also census year. We also had weekly radio and media engagement in both English and Spanish, because in South Florida, we have a very large Muslim Spanish population as well. And we had a virtual election series. I think we had about 7 programs. And we also had a targeted digital marketing campaign that reached over 24,000 people. So honestly, huge thank you to our amazing team of staff and volunteers at CAIR Florida. They really helped us engage with the Muslim community and encourage them to register and vote. So hopefully we can continue to see that moving along.
Awesome. Marcos, would you like to add anything?
We do a lot of those same things that Lara was mentioning in terms of exciting people to vote and getting the information out through radio, TV, social media. We're doing a lot of that and thinking of ways to do it better all the time. I think that the excitement, the interest is something that's contagious in any society, in any people. But I think that people also have to be aware that democracy is fragile, and that elections do matter, and that who we put in office can make a difference between whether we move in the right direction or the wrong direction on any issue, but specifically the most important one of all, which is democracy. If we eliminate democracy in our country, then we won't be able to make a change, even if that change is responsible. If you have any doubts of that, look at what's happened in some other regimes like Venezuela, and just recently the protests in Cuba, where people who do not have that right to vote are desperately seeking that power to change their government, and they just absolutely can't, because they do not have that power of vote. So we have that privilege still. Let's not throw that away, and let's not make it so that it's so difficult to vote that less people vote, and only the privileged get to vote and impose their will and their decisions on everyone else. So democracy is fragile. We need to protect it today. We needed to protect it yesterday, and we need to protect it tomorrow and every day. That is the message that I want to bring along. It will always be fragile. It's not a perfect system, because it is about being a fair system, and fairness is never an easy thing. Balance is always a difficult thing to achieve when we have so many people that think in so many different ways. So that fragility has to be protected. Anything that is fragile needs to be nurtured and taken care of, and we need to take care of our democracy. And the first step to taking care of democracy is making sure that laws like HB 90 are stricken from our constitution, are stricken from our legal system, and that we build laws that provide protections and allow every single citizen who has the right to vote to vote.
Thank you, Marcos. Kathy, would you like to jump in?
Absolutely, thank you. I want everyone to know that their vote really does matter. I know people say that all the time, it doesn't matter, but it really does. And just to prove that point, in Florida, we've had some very close elections. In the last Senate race, Rick Scott defeated Bill Nelson by just 10,000 votes. And in the last governor race, Ron DeSantis beat Andrew Gillum by just 32,000 votes. Both races were decided by less than 0.5%. So it's really true. Every vote really does count. And I think your best defense is to be a knowledgeable and informed voter. One of the best ways I think you can do that is to go to vote411.org. It's a website sponsored by the League of Women Voters, and it's nonpartisan. It's a wealth of information about all things and all aspects of voting. You can register to vote, you can check your voting status, you can learn about the candidates and issues that may be on your ballot. And also, it's been mentioned before about the For the People Act. The House of Representatives passed it, but the Senate has not done so yet. And it was, as it was mentioned before, the bill addresses voter access, election integrity and security, campaign finance, and ethics. So I encourage everyone to contact your senators and encourage them to support the For the People Act. And finally, I just want you to remember, we're all equal at the ballot box, but only if you vote. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathy. And Denise, you want to finish off?
Yes, thank you so much. I'd like to bring it back to the Constitution and kind of bring in what everyone else was saying. The Constitution's first 3 words are "we the people." And when they actually wrote that, it was like you, Laura, and Marcos was saying, it was a very small group of very privileged people. So my goal here at the League of Women Voters is to expand the "we," to incorporate as many people as possible in the process of democracy. Because when we expand the "we" and more people get involved in their democracy, we have a better government that best represents all of us, all our needs and all our wishes and all our wants. And it's very fragile, like Marcos was saying. So the more people that are engaged, the better. I also, I'm very passionate about registering as many people as possible. But registration is only a very small part. It's just one part. You got to get out there and vote. So the other thing I would like to say is that we need to, as Laura was saying, educate voters. What are their rights? Where do they need to go? Where can they get information about their candidates? All of the things that Kathy was saying on Vote 411, to educate your voters so they feel empowered that they can go to the polls, make a decision. We're not always, your vote is going to count always, but you're not always going to get the candidate or the policy that you want, but that should never discourage you from participating in the process. So we the people should encompass all of us. And the only way to really do that is to have people vote.
Thank you so much. I am really, really happy to hear all of your responses to that. I feel much better after hearing that. And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, if your vote didn't matter, they wouldn't be trying to make it harder for you to do it. So I think that's the biggest reason why you should be going out and voting, because there's a reason that it's becoming harder to do that. And we got to make sure that doesn't happen. So before we wrap up today, the last thing I want to do is give each of you a minute or two to talk about your organizations and how other people can get involved in the work that you all are doing. So Marcos, can you start us off with Allianza?
Allianza for Progress is an organization that works within the Latino community. We have a strong focus in Central Florida, and therefore a big part of our work is with the Puerto Rican community. But we work with everybody and we register everyone. And even though we're focused with the Hispanic community and sometimes make our messaging in Spanish, we do speak English very well, and we work with everyone in the community. So we're happy to do that. We do also a lot of work around leadership development. And to learn more about our organization, you can go to www.allianza.org. And before I go, I wanted to address a question that one of the constituents wrote in the chat. Anne wrote about what can Black and Brown Latino voters do to ensure that they have not been removed from the rolls? And what can they bring to the polls to prove that they're legitimate right, that they have a legitimate right to vote? Well, the first thing you need to do is to make sure that you're registered to vote if you register to vote. If you haven't registered to vote, then the first thing you need to do is register to vote. We don't have automatic voting in this state. We kind of have a form of that in some other states, but not here in Florida. So you have to proactively register to vote 30 days before an election. And so I encourage everyone to do that. If you have already registered to vote, you need to keep informed and watch out and make sure that your vote has not been stricken from the rolls, particularly if you haven't voted in the last couple elections. So go to your supervisor of election and check it out. Now, if you're not in the voter rolls, if they have taken you from the voter rolls, that's going to be a big problem. And you want to solve that before the next election. You want to solve that before 30 days before the election, because if you're not on the voter laws, you can have an ID, you can have a voting card, you can have any form of proof. They're not going to let you vote if you're not on the list.
Thank you, Marcos. And thank you for addressing that question. I appreciate that. Lara, you would like to talk about CAIR?
Sure. Well, CAIR Florida, the Council on American Islamic Relations, is a nonprofit civil rights organization. We have the vision to build a bridge of mutual understanding and promote peace and justice. Our mission at CAIR Florida is to enhance the understanding of Islam and protect civil rights for people of all backgrounds, not just the Muslim community. So to achieve this goal, we offer legal and non-legal advocacy services to combat all forms of discrimination, including Know Your Rights trainings, Islam 101 trainings, or diversity trainings. We also do interfaith and community and government engagement as well. We educate and protect and advocate on behalf of all Floridians. We educate Muslims on their religious rights in school, employment, dealing with law enforcement, traveling, etc. But we also educate non-Muslims on how to respect the religious rights of Muslims they encounter or that are in their care. We've actually provided this training to federal and local law enforcement, to employers, to school boards, to faith-based organizations, humanitarian organizations, medical facilities, and many, many others. So we protect these rights through our legal department, where we have a brilliant staff of attorneys ready to be there for you. And we advocate for Muslims to ensure that our voices are heard and we're represented, to ensure that Muslims have a seat at the table and that our interests are taken into consideration. And we are happy to be a resource for you, for anyone on Islam-related issues and questions, but also as a civil rights organization, we're happy to be a resource for you in these rights issues as well. We also have an awesome volunteer and an awesome internship program. So if you're interested in getting involved, you can check us out at cairflorida.org. And you can also email me at Ghannam, that's my first initial last name, at CAIR.com for more information. Or you can just send me some awesome dad jokes and memes. That works too.
Awesome. Thank you, Lara. And then Kathy and Denise, if you both want to talk, if one of you wants to take the lead on this, how can people get involved with the League of Women Voters?
Sure. I just want everyone to know that the League of Women Voters of Orange County is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and we welcome both men and women to join. We have many men members. Our mission is to empower voters and defend democracy. And if you would like to join, just go to lwvoc.org. We especially encourage younger people to join. And if you're a student, membership is free. So I encourage everyone to please join us and become a warrior for democracy. Thank you.
Awesome. So once again, thank you all for being here today. I am just blown away by all of the wonderful insight you were able to provide. I think this conversation is much better for it. So I really do appreciate all of you taking the time to be here for this conversation today and joining us here at the History Center. If you are okay with it, there are a couple more questions in the chat, so I can go ahead and throw those out to wrap this up if you all are good with that. One of the questions we had was kind of focusing on, I think Marcos may have brought this up in his conversation, that it can be difficult to get people to vote for candidates that are in their best interest, right? It's hard to get people to understand like which candidates are in your best interest, because obviously no candidate is totally transparent about everything they're going to do, what that would mean for you as an individual. So is there anything any of you would like to add to that about what you think can be done to help ensure that people are voting for candidates that represent their best interest?
So one thing that people can do is go to voter forums, and there's many nonpartisan organizations like ours and the League of Women Voters probably that do voter forums where candidates speak about what they stand for and what and you have a chance to actually ask them questions in a format like this, right? Through the chat, or in some cases even face-to-face in the Zoom. So there's many different options on how to get informed. Each candidate also usually publishes a website, and they have information about what they stand for and what they would like to accomplish as a candidate. And those are found on the internet. So like Kathy said before, the best voter is an informed voter, and that takes a little bit of work. You have to go in and spend some time. The good thing about the systems and how they've developed to this date is that, particularly with early voting and vote by mail, you get the ballot in your mailbox about a month before you have to turn it in. And that gives you an entire month to go through the candidates that you get to vote for. In many, and this is really important at the local level, because in many places you may hear an ad about a candidate, but they're not running in your district. They're not running in your particular area. So by having the vote by mail, you get your ballot ahead of time, and you know exactly the people that you are going to be picking. And you can do the research on every one of them. And you have 30 days to sort of study it, talk about it with your friends, look for people who you admire and respect in the community, who are your colleagues. Talk to them about the candidates and what they think about their stances on the different issues. You got 30 days really to make a decision. So those 30 days are a lot of time for you to be able to inform yourself specifically and not waste time with the people that you can't vote for. You focus on those people that are on your actual ballot. So I would recommend everyone to sign up to vote by mail and spend those 30 days before, once you get your ballot, in really understanding what each of the candidates stand for.
Awesome. Thank you, Marcos. I don't know if anyone else was wanting to jump in, but if not,
actually, you can also request a sample ballot. If you prefer to vote in person, you can get that sample ballot ahead of time. You can go to the supervisor of elections website, and this way you could do your research, before you actually go to your ballot. I usually just fill it out, so I know when I get in there what I'm going to do, and do your research. I would also like to say, when you're doing your research, make sure that you pick reliable sources that can give you very unbiased and true information. I know the League of Women Voters, on our website, we have a section. I know we have Vote 411 as a reference there, but there are also some other very good resources that you can go to do your homework and to try to pick the person that you feel, or the if it's an amendment, pick what you feel is the best for what you would like to vote for. So I just wanted to add that as well.
Awesome. And then one last thing I'll point out from the chat before we wrap up, because we are right on time here. I had a couple people point out that if you are joining us from outside of Central Florida, obviously the panelists we have on here today are all within Central Florida, but many of their organizations are not limited to Central Florida. They have Central Florida branches. So keep in mind that these organizations, like the League, like CAIR, are available in other communities as well. And even if that particular organization is not in your community, there are going to be a lot of people who are doing this type of work. So you can always find people in your own community to link up with if this is something you find interesting and that you would like to be a part of. So thank you again, all of you, for joining us today, for being here for this conversation. Thank you to our wonderful, wonderful panelists for joining today. And I'll hand it back over to Katie to wrap us up.
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and share that resource page for everybody while I give our outro here so that everybody can see those resources. And I'm also popping a couple links that are specific to the History Center again in the chat there. I want to thank Shannon and especially all of our panelists for leading such an important discussion. I'd also like to thank everyone for attending today. This is such an important issue, and we hope that you found it informative and that it provided some new perspective on not only the depth of the issue, but also some of the work that's being done to combat voter suppression and ways that we can all move forward. So for information on those and lots of other events that just scratches the surface of the things we've got coming up, please check out thehistorycenter.org/events. I've popped a link in the chat as well as a link to our support page. So please check those out if you are interested in learning more about the History Center. Thanks again for joining us and have a great rest of your day. And we hope that we see you all again soon.